Welcome to Shocking Crime Scenes, the unfolding case of a woman that leaves everyone, including detectives, wondering. The day began in one Alabama county. Two men woke up on an ordinary morning in Alabama, unaware it would be their last. They were fathers, ex-husbands, individuals navigating life after divorce. By the end of that day, both would be dead, and their deaths would be connected by a single, devastating thread. When detectives knocked on her door to ask about her ex-husband's murder, Barbara Reno didn't ask why. She didn't ask how. She didn't even ask who had been hurt. She looked at the officers standing on her porch, processing the weight of their words, and calmly asked one chilling question. Which one? In that instant, the air shifted. A routine knock became something else entirely. A single sentence that suggested a truth no one was prepared to hear, that this wasn't a singular tragedy, but the shadow of something far larger. It was short, it was quotable, and it was devastating. With just 2 words, Barbara Reno cracked open a mystery that would stun seasoned investigators and leave an entire state grappling with the realization that the day's violence might not be over. That question, which one, didn't just imply more than one ex-husband. It implied foreknowledge. It implied expectation. It implied a moral rupture so stark that, for a brief moment, even the officers standing there seemed unsure how to respond. Alabama has seen its share of violent crime, but moments like this are rare, the kind that stop professionals cold, the kind that signal the story ahead will not unfold along familiar lines. Before any timeline was drawn, before any evidence was cataloged, those 2 words announced that whatever had happened was neither accidental nor contained. Something had already gone terribly wrong, and it may have begun long before that knock on the door. To understand how that moment came to be, the story has to rewind to earlier that same day, to a quiet Alabama neighborhood where nothing about the morning suggested it would end in police lights and grief. The street was still. The houses looked ordinary. Inside one of them, an 11-year-old girl was doing what children do, existing within the assumed safety of her home, unaware that the thin barrier between routine and catastrophe was about to be shattered. There was no warning, no gradual escalation, just a knock at the front door, and then gunshots. The sound was sudden and violent, echoing through the house in a way that made no sense at first. The girl ran, instinctively locking herself inside her bedroom, her heart racing as confusion turned into fear. She didn't know who was at the door. She didn't know why someone would fire a gun there. She only knew that something terrible had just happened downstairs, and her father was involved. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone and dialed 911, her voice dropping to a whisper as if volume alone might make the danger worse. On the other end of the line, a dispatcher tried to steady her, asking simple questions, trying to impose order on chaos. But the girl's words came out in fragments, threaded with panic. There had been a knock. Her dad answered. Then she heard gunshots. She didn't know where the shooter was. She didn't know if they were still in the house. She only knew that her father had been hit, and that everything felt suddenly unreal. In that moment, the weight of adult terror fell onto a child's shoulders, and the illusion of safety evaporated. Her father, bleeding from a chest wound, had managed to make it upstairs before collapsing. The injury was severe, but he was still conscious, still aware enough to understand that time mattered. As first responders were dispatched, he fought to stay present, to hold on long enough to say what he believed needed to be said. Those final moments weren't filled with confusion about what had happened. They were filled with certainty about who might be responsible. When deputies reached him, they asked the question that always comes next. Who could have done this? And with effort, knowing the gravity of his words, he named a suspect. Not a stranger, not a random intruder. His ex-wife. That single accusation immediately reframed the crime. What might have initially looked like a random act of violence now carried the unmistakable imprint of personal history. Divorces end, but resentments can linger. Still, even in cases where former spouses are involved, shootings at the front door are not common. Investigators understand how emotionally charged these situations can be, but they also know that most conflicts, even bitter ones, don't end this way. The allegation raised more questions than it answered, but it gave law enforcement a direction and a name. As deputies secured the scene and paramedics worked desperately to save the wounded man, the quiet neighborhood transformed into a place of sirens and flashing lights. Neighbors watched from their windows, trying to reconcile the violence with the familiar street they thought they knew. Inside the house, the 11-year-old girl remained locked in her room, listening as adults moved through the space where her childhood had just been interrupted. For her, the world would be divided into before and after this moment, even if she couldn't yet articulate why. Despite medical efforts, her father's injuries were fatal. He died knowing he had identified who he believed was responsible, leaving investigators with a crucial lead and a family with an absence that would never be filled. For law enforcement, the case now carried both urgency and gravity. A suspect had been named, a child had witnessed the aftermath, and a life had been lost in a place where people expect to be safe. At this point, the story could have followed a familiar path. A domestic dispute turned deadly, an arrest, a trial. But even as officers began pulling records and tracing movements, subtle inconsistencies started to surface. The timeline didn't feel isolated. The details didn't sit neatly. And as information trickled in, it became increasingly clear that this shooting might not be an isolated eruption of violence, but part of something broader and far more calculated. That realization would come later. For now, investigators focused on the facts at hand. A man shot at his front door, a terrified child on the phone with 911, and an ex-wife named as the possible shooter. It was already a disturbing case, emotionally heavy and professionally challenging. But beneath the surface, there were indications, small at first, that the story was only beginning. By the time detectives would eventually stand on Barbara Reno's porch, armed with the knowledge that her ex-husband was dead, they would already be bracing for the worst. Still, nothing prepared them for the answer they received. Which one? Wasn't just a response, it was a revelation. It suggested awareness of more than one victim. It suggested that the day's events were connected in a way no one had yet fully grasped. And it suggested that what had started with a child's whispered 911 call was about to unravel into one of the most disturbing crime stories Alabama had seen. What began as a single act of violence, witnessed in fragments by an 11-year-old hiding behind a locked door, was already expanding beyond its initial boundaries. By the end of that day, two men, both once married to the same woman, would be dead. And as investigators worked backward and forward through the hours that separated those deaths, they would begin to understand a terrifying truth. This wasn't a crime of passion that spiraled out of control. It wasn't chaos born of impulse or rage in a single moment. It was a plan. The realization that this wasn't a crime of passion, but a plan, hung heavily over the investigation as detectives moved forward. What had begun as a single, devastating shooting now demanded a wider lens. Officers in Alabama are trained to treat every homicide as potentially connected to something larger, but even with that mindset, no one expected how quickly the scope of this case would expand. As records were pulled and calls were made across jurisdictions, a troubling question emerged. What if this wasn't the only crime scene? The first indication came quietly, almost incidentally, through routine cross-checking. Detectives reviewing regional police activity noticed another death reported earlier that same day, in a different county. At first glance, it didn't appear connected. The circumstances were different. The location was miles away. But as investigators dug deeper, comparing names, timelines, and relationships, the pieces began to align in a way that was impossible to ignore. The victim was a man. He had been shot. And crucially, he shared a history with the woman now at the center of their investigation. His name was Tomas Griffin. The confirmation hit with a jolt. Tomas Griffin wasn't just another victim of unrelated violence. He was another ex-husband of Barbara Reno. Suddenly, the language surrounding the case changed. This was no longer about a homicide. It was about two. And the realization that both victims were once married to the same woman transformed the investigation from tragic to unprecedented. Detectives now faced a chilling possibility. The shooting that left an 11-year-old girl whispering into a 911 phone might not have been the start of the day's violence. It might have been the second act. Attention immediately shifted to reconstructing the timeline. Investigators began working backward through the day, mapping out where Barbara Reno was believed to have been and when. Phone records, traffic data, and witness statements were requested. Each new detail tightened the window and sharpened the implications. According to preliminary findings, Tomas Griffin had been killed hours earlier in another county, before the shooting at the front door of the second ex-husband's home ever took place. 2 counties, 2 victims, 1 suspect, 4 seasoned detectives. Patterns matter. Crimes that seem isolated often reveal hidden connections when examined closely. But cases involving multiple victims, spread across different jurisdictions, within a single day, are rare. Even rarer are cases where the victims share such an intimate and specific link to the same suspect. As law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts, the weight of what they were uncovering began to settle in. This wasn't just escalation. It was confirmation that something deliberate was unfolding. The emotional tone among investigators shifted from shock to dread. Shock at the audacity of the crimes, and dread at what it suggested about intent. If Barbara Reno was responsible for both deaths, then the order mattered. It meant she hadn't acted impulsively after an argument or confrontation. It meant she had already crossed a line once that day, and then crossed it again. As the timeline came into focus, detectives turned their attention to how Tomas Griffin had been killed. Details from the first crime scene were scrutinized with fresh urgency. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Surveillance cameras in the area were canvassed. And it was here that the investigation began to take on a more unsettling character. Video footage from nearby businesses and residential security systems showed a figure approaching the home. At first, nothing seemed overtly suspicious. The person wasn't running. They weren't forcing entry. They were walking with purpose, carrying what appeared to be a delivery bag, the kind people see every day and think nothing of. In a world accustomed to food drop-offs and package deliveries, the bag functioned as a disguise, signaling normalcy and safety. But investigators quickly realized that this appearance was intentional. The bag didn't belong to the person carrying it. It wasn't tied to any legitimate delivery. It had been taken, stolen, and repurposed as a tool, a way to lower defenses, a way to get close enough to a front door without raising alarm. The figure's clothing was similarly calculated, nondescript, concealing, designed to blend in rather than stand out. Nothing flashy, nothing memorable, just enough anonymity to pass unnoticed. This was not the behavior of someone acting in blind rage. This was the behavior of someone thinking several steps ahead. As detectives overlaid the surveillance timeline with travel routes, the picture grew darker. The movement from one county to another wasn't chaotic or erratic. It followed a logical sequence. The time gaps made sense. There was no indication of panic or hesitation. Instead, there was continuity, a sense that each action followed the previous one with intention. For investigators, this realization marked a turning point. The emotional beat shifted again, from dread to a grim understanding. If the first body hadn't been the last, then the second killing wasn't a spontaneous escalation. It was part of a progression. And that progression suggested planning, preparation, and resolve. The implications extended beyond the immediate case. Law enforcement had to consider whether there were other potential targets, other unresolved grievances, other places Barbara Reno might have gone that day. Each ex-husband now represented not just a victim, but a marker in a pattern. The question wasn't only what happened, but why this order, why this timing, and why now? Detectives also grappled with the human dimension of what they were uncovering. 2 families, in 2 counties, were now linked by loss. Children, relatives, and friends were learning that the deaths of their loved ones weren't isolated tragedies, but chapters in a single, unfolding story. The sense of disbelief spread outward, touching everyone connected to the case. It's one thing to mourn a sudden death. It's another to realize that death was part of something larger and deliberate. As what initially appeared to be routine video, grainy, ordinary, easily overlooked, slowly transformed into something far more disturbing as analysts replayed it frame by frame. Cameras from nearby businesses and residential areas captured a woman moving through public spaces with practiced calm. Nothing about her body language suggested panic or haste. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. Instead, she moved with a kind of quiet confidence, carrying an object that immediately stood out to investigators, a delivery bag. At first glance, the bag was unremarkable. In fact, that was precisely the point. Delivery bags had become part of the background noise of daily life, symbols of convenience, not threat. People open doors for them without hesitation. They don't trigger fear or suspicion. And according to investigators, Barbara Reno understood that. Footage showed her entering a location where delivery orders were staged, blending in just long enough to take a bag that didn't belong to her. She didn't purchase anything. She didn't interact with staff. She simply took the bag and left. The act itself was small, almost mundane, but its implications were enormous. This wasn't theft for profit or necessity. It was preparation. Investigators believed the bag was never about food. It was about access. With the bag in hand, Reno could approach a front door without setting off alarms, literal or psychological. A delivery bag suggested neutrality, even helpfulness. It lowered defenses. It created a reason for someone to open the door, to step closer, to abandon the natural caution they might otherwise feel. This wasn't improvisation. It was a ruse, and it relied on a deep understanding of everyday human behavior. As detectives overlaid the surveillance footage with the reconstructed timeline, the picture grew sharper and more troubling. The murders were not spontaneous eruptions of violence. They were steps in a sequence. Each action appeared designed to reduce friction, to move her closer to her targets without resistance. The disguise wasn't elaborate, but it didn't need to be. Its power lay in its simplicity. The emotional response among investigators shifted once again, this time from dread to disbelief. Crimes of passion often leave trails of disorder. Raised voices, frantic movements, erratic decisions. This case showed none of that. Instead, it revealed patience, thought, restraint, qualities that suggested intent far beyond a momentary loss of control. As attention turned from the footage to Barbara Reno herself, law enforcement began the process of locating her vehicle. The car became a critical piece of the puzzle, not only because it connected the two crime scenes geographically, but because it represented mobility, her ability to move between counties, between lives, between acts of violence. License plate data and witness reports helped narrow down its location, and officers prepared to make contact. When they arrived, what they found only deepened their unease. Barbara Reno was outside her vehicle, methodically wiping it down. In her hands were cleaning rags and bleach. The scene was striking not because it was chaotic, but because it was calm. There was no frantic scrubbing, no visible panic. Just deliberate, careful movements, as if she were completing a task she had already decided needed to be done. For seasoned officers, the image was unmistakable. Bleach isn't a casual cleaning product in this context. It carries a specific implication, an attempt to erase, to sanitize, to remove traces of what had come before. The act suggested awareness, not innocence. It suggested that Reno understood the significance of what she was cleaning and why. As detectives approached her, the tension in the air was palpable. By this point, they were no longer dealing with a single alleged shooting. They were confronting the possibility of a calculated double homicide. Every word mattered. Every reaction mattered. The way Reno would respond could either introduce doubt or confirm their worst suspicions. They identified themselves. They explained they needed to speak with her. And then they mentioned her ex-husband. The question that followed did not come with visible shock or confusion. There was no denial, no immediate protest. Instead, Barbara Reno looked at them and asked, once again, the question that had already begun to define the case. Which one? This time, the words landed differently. Earlier, that question had been shocking because of what it implied. Now, after everything investigators had uncovered, it was horrifying because of what it confirmed. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't a nervous misstatement. It was consistent. It aligned perfectly with the evidence they had been piecing together all day. Two victims, two ex-husbands, one suspect who seemed fully aware of both deaths. The emotional beat for detectives shifted from unease to something colder and heavier, horror. Not the visceral horror of a bloody scene, but the psychological horror of recognizing intent. This wasn't someone overwhelmed by circumstances. This was someone who appeared to know exactly what she had done, and how many times she had done it. That realization forced investigators to confront the depth of the deception they were dealing with. The delivery bag, the calm movements, the cleaning supplies, the repeated question. Each element, when viewed in isolation, might be explainable. Together, they formed a coherent pattern of behavior that pointed unmistakably toward planning and control. The ruse, investigators believed, was not just about gaining entry to a home. It was about navigating an entire day of violence without interruption. It was about blending in, exploiting assumptions, and moving through public spaces without drawing attention. It was about appearing harmless long enough to do irreparable harm. As the evidence mounted, disbelief gave way to a deeper unease. This case challenged fundamental assumptions about what danger looks like. The suspect didn't match the stereotype of someone spiraling out of control. She didn't leave behind obvious warning signs in her demeanor that day. Instead, she operated within the boundaries of normalcy, using the expectations of others as cover. For law enforcement, that understanding was sobering. It meant the threat wasn't loud or obvious. It was quiet, methodical, and hidden in plain sight. By the time Barbara Reno's vehicle was secured and the scene documented, the emotional weight of the case had fully shifted. The question was no longer whether the killings were connected. It was no longer even about whether they were planned. Those conclusions had already been reached. What remained was the chilling recognition of how easily the ruse had worked, and how close the violence had come to appearing ordinary. Disbelief had given way to unease. Unease had hardened into horror. And as investigators stepped back to assess what they now knew, one thing was undeniable. The deception at the heart of this case was as disturbing as the violence itself, revealing a level of intent that would haunt everyone involved long after the footage stopped playing. By the time investigators stepped back from the immediacy of the evidence, the footage, the vehicle, the statements, the case had reached a point where the next questions were no longer about movement or method. Those had been answered. What remained was harder, quieter, and more unsettling. Why this happened, and what it left behind. Chapter by chapter, the facts had assembled themselves into a narrative of intent. Now the task was to understand the person at the center of it, not to excuse the violence, but to contextualize it within a life that had clearly been unraveling long before that day in Alabama. Investigators began turning their attention to Barbara Reno's past, knowing full well that history does not justify crime, but it can illuminate it. In cases like this, context matters. Patterns matter. The goal was not to build a psychological profile for spectacle, but to understand whether the actions of that day were anomalies or the culmination of something that had been building over time. What they found did not point to sudden transformation. It pointed to accumulation. Friends, acquaintances, and records painted the picture of a woman who had carried resentment for years. Divorces, by their nature, are emotionally fraught, but in Reno's case, investigators noted a pattern of grievances that never seemed to resolve. Instead of fading with time, they appeared to deepen. Legal disputes, personal conflicts, and perceived betrayals became part of a long narrative she told, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately, about being wronged. To those who encountered her casually, these might have seemed like complaints, the kind people voice after painful separations. But when viewed together, across years, they suggested something more enduring, a fixation. Public posts became a focal point of this phase of the investigation. Detectives scoured social media not for confessions or threats, but for insight. What they found was a trail of words heavy with bitterness and obsession, statements about betrayal, about being mistreated, about starting over, about erasing the past. There were expressions of anger that didn't dissipate with time, but circled back again and again, as if the emotional wounds were being reopened deliberately. These posts were not evidence of murder. Investigators were careful to make that distinction, but they were context. And context, in a case like this, mattered deeply. The posts suggested a person who felt perpetually aggrieved, who framed her life through the lens of injustice. There was little sense of closure in her words, little indication that old conflicts had been put to rest. Instead, they lingered, resurfacing in new forms, years after the relationships themselves had ended. To investigators, this reinforced a critical conclusion. The violence of that day was not born in a single moment. It was the endpoint of a long internal process. As this picture came into focus, the human cost of the crimes became impossible to ignore. Two fathers were gone. Men who had once shared their lives with the same woman, and who now shared an even darker connection. Their deaths were not abstract entries in a case file. They were absences that would be felt every day by the people who loved them. Children who would grow up without their fathers. Families forced to reconcile grief with disbelief. 5 children, in total, were left behind across both families. 5 lives altered irrevocably, not because of an accident or illness, but because of a decision made deliberately. For them, the story would not end with arrests or court proceedings. It would continue in birthdays missed, milestones unshared, and questions that might never have satisfying answers. Investigators understood this reality well. Behind every statistic in a homicide case is a network of people whose futures are permanently reshaped. And among those children, one stood apart, not because her loss was greater, but because her experience was uniquely searing. The 11-year-old girl who had hidden in her bedroom and whispered into a 911 phone would carry that moment with her forever. Long after the details of the case faded from public memory, she would remember the sound of gunshots at her front door. She would remember the fear that froze her in place, the confusion that followed, and the knowledge that her life had been split in two in a matter of seconds. Trauma does not end when the sirens fade. It embeds itself in memory, resurfacing in unexpected ways. Investigators, many of whom had children of their own, spoke quietly about her during briefings, not as a detail, but as a reminder of why their work mattered. Justice, in cases like this, is not only about accountability. It is about acknowledging harm, especially when that harm falls on those least equipped to bear it. As the investigation moved toward its legal phase, the narrative of the case was already clear. This was not a story defined by randomness or loss of control. It was not the product of a single argument or an impulsive act. Everything about the day pointed in the opposite direction. The timing, the sequence, the emotional consistency. Even the language Barbara Reno used when confronted by police suggested awareness rather than shock. That awareness was perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. Violence often carries with it an aura of chaos, raised voices, frantic decisions, a sense that events have spun out of control. This case defied that expectation. What investigators saw instead was steadiness, a through line that connected past resentment to present action. A progression that made sense only if one accepted that the outcome had been imagined before it was carried out. In reflecting on the case, investigators repeatedly returned to the same conclusion. Intention was the defining feature, not brutality alone, not even the rarity of two ex-husbands being killed in a single day. What made this case unforgettable was the clarity of purpose that ran through it. The planning was not elaborate in a cinematic sense, but it was effective. The deception was not flashy, but it was sufficient. And the question, which one, was not a slip of the tongue, but a window into a mindset already prepared for what had happened. That question lingered long after it was spoken. It echoed through interviews, reports, and quiet conversations among officers who had seen many things, but rarely something like this. In 2 words, it captured the essence of the case: multiplicity, awareness, and a lack of surprise. It was the moment when suspicion hardened into certainty, when the scale of the day's violence crystallized. As the story reached its resolution, there was no sense of relief, only gravity. Closure, in the legal sense, would come later, through courts and judgments. But the emotional weight of the case settled immediately. It rested on the families who would grieve, on the children who would grow up with unanswered questions, and on a community forced to confront the reality that danger does not always announce itself loudly. In the end, this case is not remembered solely because 2 men were killed. It is remembered because of how it unfolded, because of the patience involved, because of the choices that aligned too neatly to be dismissed as coincidence, because of the planning, the deception, and the moment when everything was revealed by a single, chilling question. This wasn't chaos. It was deliberate. One suspect, one day, one unbelievable crime. The next story will leave you speechless. If you think this case was disturbing, wait until you see what's coming next. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel for more crime stories like this. Watch out for the next one.